Hey BU, welcome to today's screencast on organizing your ideas to help you conquer your Kite Runner essay. The foundation of the information that I'm going to give you today comes from the screencast that I had you guys watch yesterday on transitioning from reading to writing in a literary analysis. So I just want to point out that before you move on with this one, be sure that you've watched that screencast. Okay, that transitioning screencast talked about a couple of steps that you could take once you've finished reading a book and before you start writing an essay. And the first step was to address the writing prompt. So I just want to go over that here. So your writing prompts for this culminating Kite Runner essay are as follows. Is it ever appropriate or necessary to remain a silent bystander when someone is being hurt, physically or emotionally? Is it possible to atone, which means to make amends for our wrongdoings? Do we have an obligation to be loyal and truthful to our friends and family members? And finally, what drives us to seek acceptance? So understanding those prompts helps you to understand how you're going to organize all the information that you were gathering while you were reading, and this is where those evidence logs really begin to come in handy. Okay, the transitioning screencast then talked about reading your notes, and it talked about the idea that you have two ways that you can go about figuring out what you're going to write about. Option A is to think about your thematic issues first in order to narrow down the type of quotes that you'll want to use, and then go out and find those quotes. And then option B is if you don't know what the thematic issues are, then it's entirely reasonable for you to look at your quotes first and use those quotes to help you determine a thematic issue that you most want to discuss. Now that's great advice if you're being asked to write a literary analysis essay. But if you go back and consider the prompts for this essay, you'll realize that this actually is not a literary analysis essay because you are not going to address the theme of the novel per se. Instead, you're actually going to address the essential question, and you're going to use the novel as just one piece of evidence. Now, I also want to note that you can use outside sources as additional evidence, but your objective is to prove the validity of your response to the prompt, not to prove a thematic interpretation. So in this case, one of the ways you're going to prove the validity of your response to this prompt is through the novel Kite Runner. But another piece of evidence could definitely come from any outside research that you choose to do. So given that, I've shifted the options that were provided to you on that transitioning screencast to these. Option A is to answer your prompt first and then find evidence to support it. Option B is to examine your evidence first, and then that'll help you to narrow down an answer so that you then answer your prompt. So let's take a look at how that would come to fruition. Okay, here are our prompts again in purple. And if you first want to establish how you're going to answer the question, then you'll just take a couple of steps. You're going to tap into your background knowledge. Think about what you already know, for example, about being a bystander, or about making amends for your wrongdoings, or about whether we have obligations to be loyal and truthful to friends and family, or what really does drive us to seek acceptance. I would think about what you already know about those topics, and then consider researching that issue a little bit so that you have further validation for whatever perspective you're going to take. Now, a quick note about researching. You just want to be aware of the credibility and applicability of whatever source you're using. Mainly, you want to use credible sources. So if you're going to talk about what drives us to seek acceptance, I wouldn't necessarily use a blog post so much as I would maybe use something from a peer-reviewed source, like a source who is an actual physician or a psychotherapist or something like that. And then applicability means that you're going to find a source that is really applicable to the ideas you're trying to present. So if you're trying to talk about being a bystander, you wouldn't want to talk about how, for example, bullying looks in a grown-up workplace necessarily, if what you're trying to do is talk about how Amir should not have stood by when he was 12 years old. It's just not applicable to the situation that you're trying to discuss. And then the third thing you're going to do is just try and find textual evidence from the Kite Runner to support the argument you're making. Now, if you want to go about this in the opposite order, in other words, you want to examine your textual evidence first to sort of figure out which prompt would be the easiest to answer based on the evidence that you've collected, that's fine too. So then you'd go about it this way. You would read your textual evidence, and based on that evidence, you would then think about which prompt is most easily answered by the quotes that you collected. Then you'll tap into your background knowledge to support that opinion that you already have a bunch of textual evidence for. And then finally, you can consider whether you want to research that issue because it lends further credibility to your own argument. Again, you don't want to shoot yourself in the foot by using sources that are not reliable, not applicable, and not credible. Regardless of whether you choose option A or option B, you are going to be using your evidence log to find support from the text to validate whatever argument you are going to make. So on this slide, I've provided 2 of the prompts, and I've color-coded them because one thing that you can do is to consider color-coding your evidence log. So for example, if you're thinking about using the "is it ever appropriate or necessary to remain a silent bystander" prompt, you could highlight that prompt in purple and then go through your evidence log, and every piece of evidence that you find in there that relates to that prompt, you can color code in purple. So here's one. I had one last chance to make a decision, one final opportunity to decide who I was going to be. I could step into that alley, stand up for Hassan the way he'd stood up for me all those times in the past, and accept whatever would happen to me, or I could run. And in the end, I ran. So to me, that speaks to this idea of whether or not it's appropriate to remain a bystander. And so I would take my entire row, including the evidence and my analysis thereof, and I would color code it in purple. Then I can keep going down my list. And let's say the next quote I find somehow addresses the prompt, "What drives us to seek acceptance?" So if I've highlighted that prompt in blue, then I might take the next piece of evidence that I feel relates directly to that question, and I'd highlight it in blue. That way I can get all of my evidence color-coded, and I can then go back and look at the colors. If I have more colors blue than colors purple, it might suggest to me that I want to address the question of what drives us to seek acceptance. And if that's the case, then I take all the things I highlighted in blue, I move them into a different text, then I have all of my textual evidence around that issue on one piece of paper. I read all that evidence, I can use it to formulate my ideas, and then I could go out and do my additional research about what actually does drive us to seek acceptance, so that in my essay, I am actually responding to that prompt. Remember, in your thesis statement for this essay, you are going to have to address or answer the prompt, regardless of which one you choose. And here's what that would look like. You'll want to use the wording from the prompt as much as you can. So let's say I take that bystander prompt. Is it ever appropriate or necessary to remain a silent bystander when someone is being hurt physically or emotionally? Okay, so there's the wording of the question. And if I'm going to formulate a response, it might look something like this. Although it may be difficult to push against peer pressure and/or societal norms, it is never appropriate to remain a silent bystander when someone is being hurt. I use the actual words "appropriate to remain a silent bystander when someone is being hurt," and I just change the questioning words into statement words. So instead of saying "is it ever," I say "it is never." It sounds a little bit like a jump rope game. At any rate, doing that ensures that you are actually addressing the prompt and answering it as closely as you can. Now, if you set up your thesis like this, you have to remember that it sets you up to do a couple of things. So according to this thesis, the author's going to have to talk about the difficulty of pushing against peer pressure and norms, and then they're going to have to prove that even though that can be really hard, it's still never going to be okay to be a bystander. Now, that might be where you want to include some textual evidence that talks about, say, the detrimental harm that bystanding causes not only to the victim, but to the person who's being a bystander, or something like that. Now, if you're going to go the opposite direction and you're going to say it is sometimes appropriate, then you're going to have to address when it is appropriate. And then you can use textual evidence, for example, that suggests that too many people have been harmed themselves when they try to step in, and so it actually makes it too dangerous for a bystander to step in, or something like that. Again, I don't care which position you take. I just care that whatever position you take, you substantiate it both with evidence from the text and, if you feel it's going to strengthen your argument, with evidence from outside. So if that feels a little bit daunting to you, I just want to remind you that you have tons of resources at your fingertips that you can use in crafting your essay. So from week 4, we talked about how to incorporate quotes into a paragraph. Remember, they broke it down into 3 parts. Part 1 is introduce the writer and the source that the information is coming from. Part 2 was to use the actual quote or the paraphrase. And then part 3 was to do the explanation. And if you go back to 4.8, it actually gives you some sentence starters that you can use in this situation. Because if you're going to, for example, research being a bystander, then you're going to have an author and a source, and that expert is going to have provided some information that's going to support you. So you're going to write all that smoothly and coherently into your essay, and then you're going to explain how that quote supports what you're trying to prove, and that would have been part 3. You also have information about how to write a body paragraph in both week 5 and week 9, and so that explains the importance of a claim as your topic sentence for each body paragraph, and then that each body paragraph has to include point evidence and analysis in order to substantiate your claim, and then how all of those claims will work together to prove your thesis. Now, all of that has to be done smoothly and coherently, so you have a screencast called How to Use Transitions to Increase Coherence. That's from week 5. You have Essay Organization. That was a screencast in week 10. And you have your Writing Bible, which is a document. It's a PDF, also given out in week 10. You have an example of a literary essay. Now, that'll help you some, but remember, this is not a literary analysis essay. This is a persuasive essay. You are persuading me that your opinion is valid, and you are using the Kite Runner to help validate that point. So most everything you've learned is the same. The only difference is you cannot use the default literary analysis thesis statement because you're not proving the theme of this novel. Okay, in week 11, you learned about the basics of academic writing. Those are basically those writing tips like stay out of first or second person, remember to format things correctly, stuff like that. You have your peers' considerations of theme in week 12. Now again, this is not a literary analysis essay. However, those peer ideas about theme might help you to answer one of these prompts. So I recommend you go back and read those nonetheless. All of your peers' questions and answers from week 13 might really help you. And then the screencast that I've referenced multiple times in this screencast about transitioning from reading to writing a literary analysis, that occurred this week. And finally, you have this very screencast. So lots and lots of support available for you. This is the rubric that I'm going to use to grade your work. You can find it in Schoology, but it is also here. Notice it is the exact same rubric that I used to analyze your first Kite Runner essay. It's just that I've doubled all of the points. So you will be given 20 points for having a quality thesis statement. Remember, you're going to have to get that checked by me anyway, so everybody should earn all their points on that. Your introduction paragraph has to do what any good intro paragraph does. You got 15 points for that. All of your body paragraphs have to include claim, evidence, analysis, development, coherence, transitions, and depth of thought. 80 points for that. You have a conclusion paragraph that has to do all those specialty things that a conclusion paragraph has to do, and that's going to give you 15 points. Your tone and sophistication means that your personal voice comes through and it illuminates this depth of thought, depth of ideas, and depth in your ability to use words to manipulate your audience. 30 points for that. And then your understanding of the novel. I really want to make sure that A, you read the whole thing, and that B, you understood the whole thing well enough to be able to use it as context for a larger argument about any of those essential questions that you've chosen to talk about. And finally, your conventions and your MLA format. Y'all are in 10th grade, so I expect a certain level of grammatical prowess. I will not necessarily be taking off points if you don't provide adequate parallel structure regarding direct objects, because you might not know what that means, but I do expect you not to use run-on sentences. I do expect you to use the right words, so if you don't know the difference between your and your, or there, and there, I'm going to take off for those things. And then a quick side note about that, in case you're like, yeah, Miss J, no one's ever actually taught us grammar. Well, stay tuned, friends, because January is your month for learning grammar. And with that, I feel like I've equipped you as best I can. So if you have questions, please come into my office hours this week. We can talk about everything that we need. Also know that next week you'll be required to come in for a writing conference once you have at least one body paragraph completed. Okay, have a great time writing this essay. I can't wait to read your guys' thoughts and ideas. Take care.